they asked, or all she asked, is that they make a reproduction for her, because they also wanted to make a reproduction that they would sell as a raffle quilt. So they did that. She donated the original to us, although she still has the reproduction that they made for her as a thank you. Now, this particular one is, you know, a very classic Baltimore album style. Often these were done as commission works in and around Baltimore. So get some close-up shots for you too. The applique floral wreaths, the floral baskets, the cornucopias, and some of the patriotic elements, like this one's got both the cornucopias and some of the eagles, and then eagles or other patriotic elements, monuments, those sorts of things that you see are really, really characteristic of the Baltimore album quilts and the Baltimore album style. Notice a lot of it is red and green. Even that's really, really characteristic of the Baltimore album style. So I will actually let, and I know Carolyn has an album quilt to share too. So, all right, I'll let you go ahead and share and start talking about your first one.
Melissa, do you know anything about that monument in the center of the quilt?
I don't, no, unfortunately. So Devon's doing a little close-up for us on the actual quilt. We have the actual quilt hanging up at the museum right now. I'm not sure which one it's supposed to be, like what it's supposed to be. It almost looks like the Washington Monument, but it's, the date wouldn't be right for that, so I'm not quite certain.
It's so fascinating. And you know what I love about these Baltimore albums, because we have a handful of them, and I'm seeing in yours the same fabrics as we see in some of ours. So that knowledge we have that those quilts are linked somehow. And I mean, we know the Methodist maker in Baltimore, but there's still such a mystery to us. But so many of the designs and the fabrics are the same that you know they're linked, and it's such a great story. I love that.
Well, I mean, and album quilts, I mean, you've got an album quilt coming up. Album quilts are still popular today. I mean, they've been popular for a long time. They're still popular today. The Baltimore albums, though, I mean, they really, for a true Baltimore album, I mean, they were made in and around Baltimore. So just something that was really unique about that area and that time. I mean, I think it was what, about 1840s to right before the Civil War. Right. So it was just a fairly short window for these, but you're right. I mean, there's so much similarity, so much in common in terms of the fabrics that they were using, the blocks or the style of the blocks that they were using.
Wow, that's a beauty. And I love that we both are sharing one of our most famous and our most popular album quilts, because I'm going to show our Baltimore, our reconciliation quilt. I'm going to go ahead and start my share screen now and bring up the quilt. So this is by far our most famous quilt. Can everybody see it? Does this look good to you, Melissa?
It's not shared yet.
Let me try again. All right. Technology is not my strong suit. It says it's sharing, so I'm not sure why you're not seeing it.
Now it is, but we don't have the image. So.
All right, I got to go back into my folder and pull that up. And now I'm going to shut this down so we don't see that stuff. How about now? Does that look better?
Yep.
Okay, good. So this is our reconciliation quilt, and this is probably made only about 10 years after yours. This is actually dated 1864. It's called the reconciliation quilt. It came to us with that name. And the reason that people call it that is because we believe that it was made, it's made in New York City, and it was supposed to be about the reconciliation of Jefferson Davis and his daughter. And hopefully you can see my mouse moving over the quilt. There is a block that says Jeff Davis and daughter, and they're standing there. So we did some research because it seemed odd, because first of all, Jefferson Davis's daughter was probably 12 years old in 1864, maybe not a young child in 1864. So Was she reconciling with him because of differences over the Civil War? Probably not. What we discovered was Jefferson Davis's daughter actually attended school in New York City. So after the war, after he was freed from prison, they did reconcile, or not reconcile, but they met again in New York. I don't think they ever, they have wonderful letters that they wrote back and forth to each other. So they obviously were never really apart as far as their care for each other. So the word reconciliation is a little odd with this quilt, but it also could reference the idea of the reconciliation between the North and South, because this is very much about the Civil War. And again, there's another really striking block in the third row here that I've got my mouse over. And it's a tall African-American figure saying to a man on horseback, saying, "Master, I am free." So it has this really powerful message. And this quilt has just got incredible significance in its imagery because it tells such an amazing story. And I love that about this quilt. But what I love, I think is just amazing about this quilt is that you can look at it in kind of the cultural picture, the context of the Civil War. You can look at it as a statement of patriotism, as kind of a great folk art piece. But I like the personal story behind it. This was made by a woman named Lucinda Ward Honstein. And she lived in Brooklyn. She lived in a red brick home. So we think that that block in the center is probably a depiction of her home. And there are just a lot of images on the quilt that probably are just her day-to-day experience in New York City. When we first got to know Lucinda, when this quilt came into our collection in 2001, a gift of Robert and artist James, that we knew Lucinda as a widow. And so we did research. You know, whenever we have a quilt that comes in with a name on it, we can do research. We did research, and we discovered that Lucinda's husband had actually not died in the Civil War the way we assumed. He had actually left Lucinda, moved to Ohio, and got married again. And there were letters that he was writing back to her saying, "Can I get a divorce now?" So kind of a sad thing. The family information said that he had, been involved in the Civil War and discharged. Well, we found out he was dishonorably discharged because money for uniforms went missing. So Lucinda's husband wasn't a great guy. There's a lot more information that my colleague Jonathan Gregory discovered in research, and I believe he's going to do a presentation specifically on the reconciliation quilt coming up in the future. But I think it's so interesting because when you look at a quilt like this, you love it so much, you kind of idealize the maker and you envision her in her wonderful home sitting and sewing, and this vision that we have of past makers. But when you really begin to delve into this family's history, and there's a lot in the newspapers of the time about them because it was they had some notoriety because of the difficulties in their marriage. So it always reminds me that, yes, this woman created this beautiful album quilt. It is just chock full of history and wonderful stories, but she lived a very real life. Her life wasn't perfect. Her life wasn't anything different than us. And I think the way quilts link us over time and place is so fascinating. And I think that more and more as we become more global, as right now we're the globe is in a whole, we're all together in this situation, I think we realize that human condition is the same, whether we're living in 1864, whether we're living now in 2020, whether we're living here in the US or any other area in the world. We all want the same things, and that's our family to be safe. All those kind of things are really meaningful to us. And I think it's just it always makes me realize that there is a human being behind these quilts. And I really love that reminder because you can take an object out of its context and see it in a very different way. And it's that story that's so important. I did not bring details today, but if you are interested in seeing this quilt, we do have our whole collection online at internationalquiltmuseum.org. And when you go to collections and explore, you pull up, just put in reconciliation, It'll bring that quilt up, and then you have the capability to zoom in and really look at the individual blocks in great detail. So it's a lot of fun. It's a great quilt to take a look at. I do think the other thing I'll say is really interesting about this quilt is, in addition to all the images of what seems to be kind of normal life, Lucinda's family, her daughter is portrayed on the quilt riding her horse, her husband and son-in-law in their military uniforms. But then there's also crazy things on this quilt, like elephants, coyotes, walruses, giraffes. And we've always wondered, what is it? What did the zoo just, zoos were just becoming something popular to visit in the 19th century. People would travel with animals that they charged you something to see. So how did she know those animals, and why did she include that incredible array of different figures on her quilt? So we always wish we could talk to these makers and ask them those questions specifically.
Well, and sometimes I think, is it just something that they really liked too?
Exactly.
Something that they saw and they're like, no, I'm going to put this on there because it's something that I like.
Well, every time we do try to like figure out and we come up with some kind of ideas like, oh, it could be this or could be that. If we are able to track somebody down, talk to them, oftentimes it is. It's much simpler than we think. It's much, much different than we imagine. So I think you're right. I think she just really loved her quilt, and all of these different blocks are appliqued and embroidered. So the detail work on them is really outstanding. So she was just having a lot of fun. A lot of fun. All right, I'm going to send it back to you, Melissa, if I can get this, if I can figure out how to stop share here. I'm going to have to shut this down, I think, to get back to stopping my share. There you go.
Okay. And then looks like Devin already has our next one up. So you can see the actual quilt on the table. But this is the next one that I'll be talking about. And I have to say, this is another, again, one of my favorites for the museum. Actually give a little bit of background and then explain why it's one of my favorite ones. This is a prince's feather, although I think more commonly now it's often referred to as a princess feather. But this particular one is from about 1850 or so, possibly into 1860, but the fronds have all been appliqued on. So obviously they alternate with a turkey red or a cheddar orange with then that red center flower. I do have a close-up of that just so you can actually see what that looks like. The cheddar orange, so that orange color is either a chrome orange or an antimony orange. So in either case, it's actually a mineral-based dye that they use to create that color. The green, I'll actually flip back and forth. The green is a two-step process. So it was either yellow dyed over the blue or blue dyed over the yellow to get the green. What's interesting is if you look at the top of the quilt, the very edge, like the border on that, is a slightly different shade. So we don't know if she ran out of fabric, if she just decided to do it a little bit differently, if she used something different. I mean, it's very specifically done, but just kind of makes it a little bit more fun to see, some of the challenges or decisions that a quilter even 150 years ago made, or 170 years ago made. The pattern name most likely comes from one of two different things. It's possible the original pattern started off mostly because of its similarity to the prince's feather plant. It's about a 6 foot tall plant with red and green leaves. And if you look at it kind of from the top, the pattern is very similar to the shape of the flowers that you see on this quilt. So it's possible that that's where the original idea for it came from. You saw a real resurgence in the popularity of it, though, following Prince Albert's visit to the United States in 1860, because his royal crest actually looks very similar to this. So it's possible that, maybe she was inspired by that, or again, maybe she just liked the pattern. the reason that it's a little bit close-up shot of the quilting itself. Now, the reason this is one of my favorites, it's a beautiful quilt, but the real reason that it's one of my favorites is this is one of 2 quilts at the museum that we fondly refer to as the dump quilts. That is DUMP, dump quilts, because that's where they were found. So
Oh my
the
gosh.
story of how they came to us is really what that amazing connection. These 2 quilts were both thrown away. So back in the 1970s, a gentleman went to the Cedarburg dump, so the local dump, looking for something that he could use as a toy box for his kids. So he found this old trunk, thought that would be the perfect thing. He could clean it up, put it in the back of his truck, took it home, didn't open it up, got home, opened it up. This was one of 2 quilts inside.
Oh
So, I mean, these 2, this one, the other one is a Mexican rose variation. But it's just both have very similar, if you look at the border, the swag border along the edge is very similar in both of, actually it's the same in both of them. Some of the coloring and things like that is very similar, and they were found together. So, you know, there's a lot of similarities between the 2, so we're fairly certain that they were made by the same person. But we have no other information about them. We don't know the maker. We don't know, given that the Mexican rose, both quilts are from about the same, dated about the same time period, but given that that one was also often a comment on the Mexican-American War, both of these have slightly political connotations. So it's possible that this was just, you know, a maker who was very politically aware of what was going on at the time, or she just, again, really liked both patterns. But the story is just incredible. I mean, these were 2 quilts that were literally saved from being thrown away by somebody who just decided to go and find a new trunk. And then found these 2 beautiful pieces, and both actually in really great condition too. So again, one of the reasons it's my absolute favorite. I just love the story of how they eventually found their way to us. And then the couple, the gentleman who found them and his family hung on to them, and then eventually donated them to the museum. So they were looking for a new home and eventually gave them to us.
What a great story. What a sad thought that they could have been lost. Isn't that just crazy? Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Yeah.
But, you know, but they weren't. I mean, that's what we have to focus on. So they could have been, but they weren't. So,
yay. Thank goodness.
but it makes you wonder about how many others, you know, aren't quite so lucky and don't have the same fate where somebody finds them. And even him, I mean, finding them and then recognizing that there was something of value to them. So it wasn't just finding these 2 old quilts in a trunk and then getting rid of the quilts. He wanted the trunk. He still thought that it was, no, let's hang on to these, and then they hang on to them for, you know, over 30 years before donating them to us.
Thank goodness. That's great. That's great. That's such a beautiful quilt. Interesting how you can see how the fabrics have changed colors a little bit. That green must have had a little bleach or something on it that made it really blue. And so, but you know, those are the kind of things that really never bother us at a museum. People always say, oh, I have a piece that I'd like to give you, but you know, but it's so fascinating because that tells us so much, and we don't really get thrown by that. It's just another opportunity to kind of know more about the quilt.
It's kind of the personality of the piece.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and this time I think I found a way to open it so that I can zoom in a little bit, because we did have somebody ask if I could zoom in on the last box. If we have time at the end, I can always go back to the reconciliation now and zoom in, but you can, like I said, get that on the our database too. But I'm going to try this way. We'll see if this works now. So, can you guys see that?
Yep.
Great, because on this page, I can use my zoom feature. So what I'm showing you today is one of our most famous Nebraska quilts. This is a 1940 piece made by Grace Snyder, who is considered the mother of grandmother of Nebraska quilting. Grace Snyder was a woman who settled out in the sandhills of Nebraska. When she was a child, one of her jobs was to go out and keep an eye on the cattle, sit out in the field and make sure they didn't wander too far. And she would bring her little box of fabric and work on her piecing while she did that. There's a great book about Grace Snyder and her life on the ranch in the Sandhills. Her family still owns the ranch. They just about 10 years ago got their 100-year medal for having been out there farming on the ranching in the Sandhills. But the book is called No Time on My Hands, and it's by Nellie Snyder Yost, which Y-O-S-T. That's her daughter. So her daughter wrote about her mother's life and her quilt making. Grace in that book describes her 3 wishes. The thing she wanted most of all is she wanted to marry a handsome cowboy, she wanted to fly above the clouds, and she wanted to make the most beautiful quilt that was ever seen. And I think she accomplished all this. She married her cowboy. She finally, I think at the age of 90, traveled and went for a plane ride and got to travel the way she wanted. And she made, I think we know of at least 30 some quilts. She made some that were made, and she called them her everyday quilts, made for her family, and those were used and washed, but carefully survived. But she also made what she called her show quilts. And her family has given some of these to the museum. So this is her mosaic. This is done with all hexagons. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a little bit better. It's a little fuzzy as we get too close. When the first time I saw this quilt, I said, do you mind if I put a quarter down so I can really, kind of take a photo and really know the scale of those pieces? These pieces are closer to a dime size than they are a quarter size. They are so small. So there are, I want to say 50,000 hexagons in this quilt. There was a gentleman in Illinois named Pratt. Now, what was his name? No, I'm getting his name. I'm drawing a blank. There are 2 gentlemen from Illinois. One is Pratt and the other one I cannot remember right now. Anyway, he also made mosaic quilts like this. And Grace Snyder actually wrote a letter to him, and she'd seen his quilt like this. And she said, I love the pattern. Do you mind if I make one? I just wanted, to ask before I did. And that started a kind of a lifelong correspondence between these 2. He said, by all means. So, but he'd made a quilt with about 40,000 pieces in it. Hers came in at about 56, I believe. And so he really was challenged by that. So he went back and made another quilt that has about 70,000 pieces in it. And both that quilt and this Grace Snyder quilt were chosen as 2 in the top 100 of the 20th century. So they were shown together at the Houston International Quilt Festival in 2000, which was just an amazing experience. We got to know Grace's children, who, when I met them, were 90 and 91. She had 2 daughters, and they were busy writing a series of kind of fictional books, or more storytelling books rather than historic. And they had started at 90, and they had planned out a series of 10 books. And they actually got, I think, 8 of the 10 written in their lifetime. And I just love that they were starting their project at age 90 with the goal to write 10 books. So the Snyder family was really amazing, and we are so lucky to have these pieces. Many of you might know Grace Snyder's most famous quilt is her Petty Point basket quilt, which is at our State Historical Society. The family really loved Grace's quilts. They recognized that they were really important, so they donated a lot of her pieces to museums. And the Petty Point basket quilt is, again, tiny, tiny pieces. I can't even imagine how you hold these tiny pieces and stitch them together. So it's beyond me, but this is just a spectacular quilt, and one that people really love to see every time we pull it out. So I'm going to flip it back to you again, Melissa.
I cannot get over the sheer number of pieces and the size of those pieces. It's just mind-boggling.
It is.
I don't think I'd have the patience.
And you wonder, did they have a design board? Yeah. I mean, how did she plot this out? And
so precisely,
it's mathematical.
so accurately. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Sue Reich is a historian who did a book, and it's literally just about like every mention she could find about people who made quilts, and they were mentioned in a newspaper. So it's notice after notice of these. And it's really fascinating because at the end of the 1800s, it seemed to be really important to document how many pieces. And so newspaper article after newspaper article just says, oh, I made a quilt with this many pieces, or so-and-so made a quilt with this many pieces. And I just don't understand that kind of quilt making at all. That's not something I think I could stand to do. So, but it was very competitive, very competitive.
Sounds like it. I mean, but what an amazing piece. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. The colors, everything. I mean, how she did it is just beautiful too. So she had a good eye for color too.
Yes, she did.
Right, well, I've brought up the next one that I am going to share. This one is called Aunt Kitty's Fantasy. So it's actually a velvet coverlet, dated about 1840 to 1845. It was made by a woman named Catherine Weeks Burchard. It was actually made in England, and then she brought it with her to the United States. But Catherine Weeks was trained as a seamstress and then a milliner. And what she made this quilt out of is what makes this really special. So it is a velvet quilt, or a velvet coverlet. But all of the scraps, so all of these tiny little scraps that she used, she was actually the milliner for Queen Victoria's coronation. So all of the scraps that she used are ones that she saved from the hats that she made for the ladies and for the Queen. So this was her way of commemorating the coronation. So these are all hat scraps. All of the things in the quilt or in the coverlet are actually hat scraps. She, at the end of each day, she collected all of the scraps and then took them home, and took those fabric remnants home. And she actually lived on Downing Street. So she then cut them and pieced them. You can see that center medallion right here, which is this one right here. So she did that first, and then she did the rest of the, arranged the rest of the quilt. But she said that her family said that she was often thinking about her brother Thomas and her brother's Thomas boyhood friend George, who were both away on ships near the North America, actually looking for whales. So her brother and his friend were actually whalers. When the war broke out between Mexico and the United States in 1846, Thomas's vessel was actually confiscated by the US government off the coast of San Diego. So because they confiscated his vessel, they actually gave him a land grant, and Thomas's happened to be in Wisconsin. So in 1848, Thomas and George claimed the land in Wisconsin near Sheboygan, so maybe 40 minutes north of where the museum is today. And then Kitty, as she was known, Catherine Kitty, as she was known, eventually joined them in Wisconsin and ultimately married her brother's boyhood friend and her lifelong friend. So she married him when she was about 44 years old in 1855, but she'd completed this quilt in England and brought it with her. So she did do this, or completed the coverlet and brought it with her. She did this as a tied quilt. So you can see some of the other close-up shots here. This is the back, which it's so much fun to see. You know, this is the front, what's going on in the front, and then something so very different in the back, on the back. And it's hard to see it, but the ties are even very artfully arranged, and you cannot tell from the front exactly where it's tied. You really can only see where the ties are from the reverse and from the back. and actually did put a few arrows so you can actually see where the ties are, because even in the backing, it really disappears. So she did a great job of kind of hiding it, and showing off some of those sewing skills. But again, it's just such a fun story. Both the coronation, you know, her eventual marriage, the land grant, the seizure of the ship, and everything. But just an amazing story, not just to get them here to the United States, but to get this piece here to the United States from England. I'll flip it back over to you, Carolyn.
That's such a great story. That's amazing, and so great to have that. You know, we always are just so thrilled when we can find these stories that relate to quilts, because, you know, it's a beautiful piece, but when you know all that information and you have that background, it just adds so much to it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I was really glad you put the arrows on the back, because I didn't even see the ties until you pointed them out.
Even knowing that they were there, and I mean, Devon's actually showing, you cannot tell on the front exactly how she tied it. It really is just the back that you see. But even when I was looking, I knew that they were there, and I had to really look in the photos in order to actually put the arrows in. So I'm like, I was trying to figure out different ways to do it and try to draw attention. I'm like, no, I need something that's like big that says, hey, it's right here.
You know, and I love that technique, because I'm not always fond of how ties look on a quilt, especially when it's got a really detailed pattern like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen that on some crazy quilts too, where people would tie it to the back, and it's such an ingenious way of using a kind of a simpler, less time consuming way. Or like with this, the heavy velvets and all those seams,
Right.
it would be so hard to quilt, but it also doesn't distract from the design. And I love that
Mm-hmm.
technique for that reason.
Yep. It really adds to it, and it makes it, you know, it keeps the design as she intended it, and as she really wanted it to be. It's obvious she put a lot of thought into exactly how she wanted this to look.
Yes. Oh, it's amazing. Okay, I am going to go ahead and share my next screen here. How's that look? Oops, there we go. I'm sharing one of my all-time favorites from our collection, and people always ask me that question, you know, which is your favorite? What do you like best? And it's always really difficult to say.
Like picking a favorite child, right?
Yes, it's exactly like that. It's so hard to know. But this is a piece that was actually in one of our recent exhibitions called Old World Quilts. And again, if you want to go to our website, we put all of our exhibition materials on there. And I really wanted to do that exhibition because I wanted to show the pieces that we had that were really, really early examples of quilting, and we just hadn't had an opportunity to before. So in that exhibit, you'll see quilts that date back as early as the 1600s. So 400 years worth of quilts. And the really, I'm always intrigued with the connection between what we know as quilt making and India, which is where our original cottons came from. Cotton dyers were just masters at how to create these beautiful colors. They were exported to Europe and America. And so a design like this overall design, this piece is actually about 1710 to 1730. It was made in England, and it's all embroidered, and I'll zoom in to show you a few more details in a moment. But the overall design, that center medallion with the design kind of cut apart in the four corners, so you can see how that's balanced, and that outer vining border. If you think about the album quilts we looked at, like your Baltimore album, it still has, I mean, that's 250 years later about, or 150 years later. I'm having trouble with my math today. But the idea of the center medallion with those corners, with the outer border that has that beautiful kind of swag, that design style that came out of India, very closely related to Oriental carpets, was so strong and so appealing that it remained consistent in textiles, particularly in quilts, up until almost the Civil War, when we really see the development of pieced quilts. Though even some of our early piece quilts have center medallions in them, it's just not so obvious. So I think the overall design of this is just phenomenal, and we see it repeated a lot. The other thing, and I'm going to zoom in now to show you, and again, these photos are hard to get this close of a detail on them. So you've got this center medallion, as I said, it's all embroidered, and it's actually embroidered with metallic thread. So what we see as looking very brown, what looks like kind of a brown fabric, is actually a satin stitch kind of fill that is done with a metallic thread. I don't know if any of you have tried using metallic thread, but I tried making Christmas ornaments one year and tried to use metallic thread, and it's literally just like a thin, it could be gold or silver in this case, thin little strip of that metal that's wrapped around a thread. And I mean, it's so intricate and so difficult. And when you sew with it, as you pull it through your fabrics, it just separates. It's so difficult to work with. But it was one way that a piece like this was really elevated. And at this time, this early in our history, quilts like this would have been very much a luxury item. They were not something that everybody could afford. Obviously, the middle class, the lower class would not be able to care for a piece like this. It's all silk, metallic threads, amazing work. But what I found truly fascinating, and hopefully here to maybe say the left area, if you can see my arrow moving, you see this background quilting. And this is something that I'd read about, but I'd never seen before I saw this quilt. I'm gonna see if I can go just a little closer so you can see that stitching. And it was so interesting to me because we were told that this was an 18th century quilt, but when you're looking at that quilting, it's like a continuous line, like your sewing machine would sew. There's no spacing between it. And that was very confusing. And it's so tiny and regular that it almost looked like machine quilting, which was really confusing us. And then I remembered reading, Lynn Bassett did a wonderful book on early quilts. And she talks about false or flat quilting. And that's what I finally realized we were seeing in this quilt. And flat quilting is actually a quilting almost more like an embroidery stitch in a way, because you use a back stitch. So you come up, you go back to the first stitch, and so you fill the entire line of stitches. You can only do one stitch at a time, so it's a lot more labor intensive than saying hand stitching, where you could put 4 or 5 stitches on your needle at once and then pull through. In this case, it's done with yellow silk. And the use of yellow silk in a lot of early textiles is another indication of that early time period. Again, we don't know where the yellow silk came from. We haven't been able to distinguish exactly where that came from. There were centers in India where yellow silks were produced, and so that silk thread might have been produced there. We also know that there was an island off of Italy that did a lot of silk production. It could have been, as this piece was made in England, it could have been there was a center there, but we just haven't found that information out. So a lot of the early quilts that we showed in our exhibit, Old World Quilts, are still really a mystery to us. The only thing we can do is look at other collections. We put them all together as a group. You compare them, you try to really identify them. And the yellow silk that is in one of our pieces from this exhibition was actually identified by Linda Eaton, who is a scholar who actually did dye testing. And the use of weld was something that was limited to Europe typically. And so we do think that the yellow silk probably came out of a European source rather than coming from India. But as one other scholar said, well, who's to say they weren't sending the yellow silk to India for it to be made there? So we just slowly but surely are getting more and more clues. And hopefully we're going to learn more about these pieces, but they still are really relatively unknown to us. So I just found that exhibit so much fun to work on. I learned to embroider before I learned to quilt, so I love embroidery, and you'll see in that Old World Quilt exhibition a lot of embroidered pieces that were made to replicate the cotton fabrics and the overall design. So if you want to learn more, go to Old World Quilts on our exhibition page. All right, Melissa, back to you.
You really do see the influence. I mean, as soon as you said the influence about the rugs and stuff, like you can absolutely see that in there. As soon as you said it, I made the connection. So, well, it's just amazing how much, I mean, even if you're coming from, or it's from one part of the world, how much it translates to other parts of the world, and how much, I mean, back and forth and influence there was from one region to the next.
Yeah.
Or even similarities between styles or colors or use of color in that.
Right.
So the next one I'm going to show isn't actually a quilt. It'll come on. Get through. So yes, this is a textile fragment, but it's hard for us to tell too much information from this because it is just a fragment. One of the reasons I wanted to include this particular piece, it is one of the oldest things that we have in our collection. The specific date on it is a little bit tricky. This dates to either the Wari culture, which was in South America from about 500 to 1000 AD, or else the Chicani culture, which dates from about 1000 to 1476 AD. So in either way, this is a pre-Columbian textile. So this was made prior to Columbus setting sail to the North and South America. This is a South American piece. It was actually donated to us by a collector named Richard Dainert. We received an incredible array of just really wonderful pieces from all over the world from him, and very appreciative. So there's a lot of real interesting pieces, interesting things that we received from him. One of the things that I love about this piece is it's actually tie-dyed. So we tend to think of tie-dye, you immediately flash to the 1960s, the 1970s, and then you realize, no, this is, about 1200 years, 12 to 1500 years prior to that, and they were tie-dyeing. So we actually have close-up shots so you can see what the fibers actually looked like with this textile, with this piece. So it is a woven cotton piece, would have been hand spun. The design and the dye was actually done by tying small pebbles or other objects into the cloth and then placing it in the dye bath. So the blue, it's a little bit easier to see that this is actually blue from here, is actually an indigo dye. There is a variation of an indigo plant that is native to South America. So that's what they were actually using to dye this. You can see a little bit of this, almost where it looks black on the screen. We are fortunate enough, we have a researcher who's actually working with us named Diane Newberry, who is researching this textile and others like it. We actually have a program scheduled with her originally for June. Stay tuned, we'll be rescheduling it. It's supposed to be a lunch and learn. So we'll be rescheduling it for later this year, hopefully. But if you're interested in some of the true antique textile pieces, the pre-Columbian textile pieces, and seeing some of the others that we have in the collection, stay tuned. We'll be mentioning the date for that. But I just love, we have a tie-dye workshop that we do each summer. Originally started with kids, and then the adults kept going, but we want to do it. So now we actually offer it for adults as well. And it's just amazing to me. Again, we really think of certain things as being, really reminiscent of a certain time period, and you realize just how long a history these things have, and just how far back a lot of these techniques actually go. So flip it back over to you.
Isn't that cool? Oh, wow, a Peruvian textile. It's just so fascinating. Don't you always wonder, like, if the person who wove that, what were they thinking? Could they ever, because sometimes you think, oh, I wonder if anybody else will look at this piece I'm making. I don't think anybody ever probably thought there would be a quilt museum that their piece would end up in. And you just want to be transported back to their lives. And you kind of can be when you're around these textiles, but it's just so fascinating. What a
Yeah,
beautiful
and
piece.
because of the size of this, I mean, we'll never know exactly what it was used for. It is just a fragment. It's a relatively small fragment, but we'll never know exactly yet. So Devon's putting her hand next to it so you can get an
Wow.
idea. It's about the size of somebody's hand. So we'll never know exactly what it was used for, but it's still, there's still so much that you can learn from something, even something that small.
It's really beautiful. Wow. Well, I'm going to jet us off into something very new here. This is a 2004 piece. This is a quilt by artist Radka Donnell. It's called Summer Rain, and it is just one of my absolute favorites. Radka Donnell started quilting in 1965. She's one of our earliest quilt makers. She looked at quilts in a very kind of metaphorical way. She really liked the idea that quilts were really personal because of the way you use them, that you wrapped up in them, and that they talked a lot about the human condition. And she actually calls them, the quilt is an icon of personal feeling and hope. And so Radka was also a poet. She wrote a number of published a number of poems that she wrote, and she's just an amazing artist in so many different ways. But there's something about this quilt. We had this up on exhibition. I was given an opportunity to show some of my favorites in an exhibition that marked my 20 years at the museum. So this is 3 years ago already. It was called Discovering the Collection. And we have every fourth grader in Lincoln comes to our museum to see the quilts, and we would sit in front of this quilt and I would just have the students just talk to me about what they saw. And it was so interesting because it really communicates so well, this idea of a summer quilt and that summer rain. And I think it's so strikingly beautiful because of that. And you know, springtime is my favorite time of year. I long during the winter, the cold winters here. Yes, I just rolled my eyes. I don't know why I live in a city where we have winter at all. I still haven't figured that out. I guess it's because the quilt museum's here. But I just always long for those first yellow blooms in the summer, the forsythia that blooms here in Nebraska in just huge numbers, because it's just such a sign of hope. And so I feel like she really does stir up certain emotions in people when you look at her quilts. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see it a little bit better. The other thing that Radka became kind of well known for, and I don't know if this quilt is, I can't, yeah, this is actually machine quilted. So she was one of the first people to really begin to use machine quilting in her pieces. She made over 700 quilts. So she kind of had to machine quilt to get them all finished and completed. Her daughters still have a large number of her pieces in the collection, but she's just really a pioneer in our quilting world, and just an amazing artist. And when people ask us, like we get a lot of conversations about why do you pick certain quilts, particularly say in the studio quilt genre. And I really think it's because certain pieces, whether it's a good or bad thing, you are so drawn to, you can look at them over and over again. They're so interesting. Your eye moves across the piece. It's what I like to call, and I stole this from Stephen Colbert's show. He was talking to a curator of a gallery in New York City, and he talked about wall power. And when I try to describe what attracts me to a quilt, it's really that wall power. What is it about it? Does it capture my attention? Does it keep my attention? Does it stay in my head? And that says a lot to me if someone's able to accomplish that on a very subjective level. I have to be very aware of that when we're building a collection and trying to be encyclopedic, which is what we do here at the museum. But it's just, I love the impact a quilt has when you're standing in front of it, and how it somehow calls to your soul and speaks to you. And so I cannot get enough of this quilt. I love looking at it. So I always put it in my presentations if I have an opportunity to, because I think it's just such a stunner.
It's what any great piece of art should grab you.
Exactly.
And do that, pull you in over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that it's supposed to have some impact. And that is the fun thing too with the kids is that, well, say, you know, you don't have to like everything you're going to see. So I'll say, what do you think? Do you like it? Do you not like it? And those, it's the little guys especially tend to be kind of like, you know, they're kind of rowdy. They're not sure what we're doing at the museum. But when you start saying to things like, well, do you like it or not? Boy, they really have an opportunity. They love telling you what they think. They get really involved. And I will say that Radka's piece is one that they generally really do like. And when I tell them that it's called Summer Rain, they're like, of course it is. Look at it. It's so sweet.
It's kind of hard not to have that one make you smile. I mean,
It does.
it's the colors, the bright, I mean, it's bright, it's sunny, it feels like summer. I mean, it absolutely does. So it's kind of hard not to have it, you know, create that kind of reaction for you.
Yeah, I love it.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody has questions, if you want to, I mean, Carolyn and I could go on, we know, forever. But if anybody has any other questions, if anything, if you want to post them in the chat, we'd be happy to answer any other questions that you might have about the quilts or textiles that you saw today. Other ones that either of the museum, questions about the museum itself. I know I think most people are probably hopefully familiar with both of our organizations, but Carolyn, if you want to do a real just brief kind of intro about the International Quilt Museum.
I'd love to. Thank you. Yeah, we are affiliated here with the University of Nebraska Lincoln in Lincoln, Nebraska. We are now, I'd say probably about 5,700 quilts in our collection and another couple thousand objects because we do collect some ephemera and materials. Our quilts travel all over the world. We are a truly international collection. So not only do we collect the American pieces and try to I like the term encyclopedic because we are trying to represent a little bit of everything, which is a real challenge. But that also means that when we get offered quilts, we oftentimes have to turn them down because we're trying to do a little bit of everything. So we've been really fortunate to travel the world with our collection. We traveled and sent quilts all over, and I always get to go with them. So that's been an absolute joy in my life. Our website is incredible. We built our museum in 2008, and so we have 6 different galleries here in the museum that we are constantly programming, and they are on a staggered schedule. So I'd encourage you to go to our website. If you want to stay involved and know more about what's happening, because we have programs like you do, we do a quilt of the month, and you can sign up online. It's free. We're not going to, there's no ads, but you can get a quilt every month along with our calendar of events, so you can stay involved and know more about what we're doing. Just like Melissa said with their programs, we are bringing in amazing artists, amazing quilts. There's always lots happening, and I feel like because we have such a varied collection, just like you do, we have a little something for everybody.
Thank you so much again for joining, for being a part of this. We wanted this to be just a fun conversation. I think one of the comments that we got was they love the back and forth chat. And that's exactly what we wanted. We just wanted this to be a fun conversation. One of the things we started thinking about early on is, okay, what are the different things that we could do like this? And talking about the pieces is some of the most fun things. So we figured this would be a fun one to do.
See, we should do this all the time, Melissa.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts in Cedarburg, we're in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, which is just about 30 minutes north of Milwaukee. The museum is located inside a restored 1850s barn. So we've completely changed the interior of it, or renovated the interior of it. So it's just a really gorgeous spot to be able to exhibit quilts and textiles. And we do have all sorts of different pieces. So we obviously collect quilts. I mentioned that you showed the textile scrap. We have wheat weavings, we have wearable art, lace, Stephen grafts, so a whole variety of different types of pieces, as well as some ephemera related to those pieces as well, just like Lincoln collects too. museum in Cedarburg, we also do a ton of education programs. So like you guys, we do, I think on average, about 50 to 60 different programs a year, so classes and workshops. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. Like Lincoln, we do not post any ads in it unless they're things for us.
Yeah.
So it's our stuff. There aren't any other ads or anything like that that are in it, but the Barn Blast goes out once a week on Fridays. It's free to receive. We don't share the list. We don't sell the list. So it's a great chance to find out what's going on. If you're interested in programs like this and attending more of the programs like this, we're doing these every Friday, at least through June. Devin, I did get a request for you to zoom in on the quilt. I don't know if it's possible to move a little bit closer to the quilt that you currently have up. We, both Carolyn and I were talking, we weren't sure exactly how long we talk about both of these, so we both have extra pieces that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So the one that Devin is showing is one of the ones that we just didn't have a chance to chat about. But I mean, there's a huge variety of just really wonderful things. The museum we change our exhibitions 4 times a year. So, and the exhibition schedule is posted on our website. It's wiquiltmuseum.com. And I see Emily actually posted the link if you want to sign up for that Barn Blast, that newsletter. I also just want to thank everybody for coming and enjoying this. We will be posting this to the museum's YouTube page. So we would be happy to have you guys watch it again if you're interested, get a closer look if there's something you missed. But we also encourage you to make donations. You know, with the museums being closed right now, our regular sources of revenue are cut off. So we really appreciate any donations. If you enjoyed this, please do donate. You can donate either through PayPal on our website, or if you go to the education page on our website, there's specific links to be able to donate for this program. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are splitting all of the donations between the 2 museums. So both museums will be sharing the donation. So it goes extra far this time. Okay. To get somebody asking who the artist for the crazy quilt is, we don't actually know who the artist was on that one. So it's just a really trying to double check my notes, see if I actually have one. But I don't think we actually know who made that one.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Nope, we do not know. It's about 1885. It's a crazy quilt, so not surprising. The reason we'd actually pulled it out, I mentioned the Stephen graphs, is, and that's what Devin's actually focused on right now, is one of the Stephen graphs. So the museum actually has a huge collection of those individually. And Stephen graphs are usually small jacquard weavings that were done as souvenirs. So a lot of times they're something political or something fair or something like that. So they're usually about postmark or bookmark size, but some quilters incorporated them into their quilts. So we have some pieces that actually have them in the quilts, and then we have others that are just on their own. But the museum has hundreds of the Stephen graphs. But again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for asking
quick
me.
Email asking, could you help us? So thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.